Alright, I can't believe I actually have to state this because this video contradicts itself by explaining what the actual cause of a propane based explosion was and then trying to imply that the cause was something entirely different. So, background propane bottles. They contain flammable gas. Leaks are bad. Leaks are more likely to occur when you are using aged canisters. Even 20-pound canisters, those ones that are generally used about the size of a grill, all the way up to the 100 to 500-pound ones you see sitting outside with a metal fence around it and a vent on the top, usually, or ones that are buried, all of them have the potential to eventually leak, especially if any fittings anywhere along the pressure line are loose or don't have proper sealant, like Teflon tape or some kind of pre-applied paste-based sealant. All of them have the potential to leak. It's not just 1-pound bottles. So, you don't leaks are possible, and unless you can be absolutely sure that there are no leaks, meaning you actually use a soap water solution for any of your threaded connections, assume that it is leaking ever so slightly, even if it isn't actually leaking. So any threaded connection should be done in an area where the amount of propane in the environment cannot reach a critical concentration, because propane and other similar hydrocarbons will tend to form a layer near the bottom layer of the floor. So if you're using a space heater on the floor, it will quickly ignite and cause a fire. But like if there's a tiny itty bitty leakage, then a space heater somewhere, say up on a dresser, will not quite reach the ignition point until a critical level has been reached and an actual explosion occurs within the room. But in fact, you should not be using a threaded propane connection that is not like wrenched down so tightly with all kinds of thread seal jammed in there to make sure that it does not leak. So let's look at what Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which I guess that little check mark means it's a verified. Yep, it's a verified account, meaning that it's like some sort of government agency. Let's see what they have to say about the why we should never refill 1-pound propane bottles. I am going to dislike it because I have already found several errors with their methodology admitted in their own words as they go on. So, let me just mute the microphone so I do not get feedback, because I hate when people do that when they have stuff set up wrong. So, mute.
Knowing how to keep your propane or liquefied petroleum gas cylinder safe is very important for your safety and the safety of those around you.
Okay, this is 100% true. I see a lot of 20-pound propane bottles, those grill-size canisters that a lot of people have out by the back of their barbecue, that are covered in a surface layer of rust. This is outright bad. You should not have a canister in the weather if you can avoid it. Covers for your canisters that are on your, say, your driving your camper trailer, those covers are actually extremely important. It's the difference between a canister going boom and having a nice camping trip, because it can fail at any point as soon as rust starts damaging the ability of the steel to maintain structural integrity. But let's continue.
The U.S. Department of Transportation, or DOT, cautions you to never refill DOT-39 cylinders, such as the 1-pound cylinders used for camping. While many types of propane cylinders are designed to be refilled, a DOT-39 cylinder of any size is strictly non-refillable.
Well, if DOT-39 is more than just the 1-pound camping cylinders, then there are multiple different variants. So there could be a refillable version made. So I'm guessing DOT-39 is actually a classification in law, a certification, not actually a non-refillable canister outright. Damn it, sorry about that. Background notifications. I've already screwed up and I'm not going to redo it for that. So, DOT-39 is a classification, not actually a type of canister. Good. So they keep saying DOT-39, that means the classification of certification, not actually any particular construction, because there are multiple variants, as they so admitted.
Flames overtook this kiosk so quickly, investigators say Courtney Campbell never had a chance to escape.
Propane explosions are tragic and sad. There are ways to mitigate risk, and pretty much any risk is going to exist no matter what when you are using a pressure vessel containing a fluid gas mixture, either in the case of a hydrocarbon like propane or butane, liquefied natural gas, that tends to exist as a liquid until the pressure drops or the temperature raises enough to cause it to boil. With propane, it's always a level of liquid and then a layer of gas above it, because in 99.9999 whatever percent of cases, you're not going to get down to the negative 40 degrees Celsius it takes to reach the absolute lowest point in which propane will boil. It's somewhere around negative 40, but you never get that naturally on Earth. You may get a reduced amount of gas pressure because you're using the gas so fast that the boil off causes it to cool down even more, and eventually you'll reach a point where the gas, it's the liquid version of the liquid phase of the fuel, is so cold that it can no longer boil very easily, and so your output flow will basically drop to nothing. Well, effectively nothing. In which case, you do have problems, but that's actually dealt with in a lot of high pressure regulator scenarios. They actually, in a lot of professional scenarios, they will have a bucket of water specifically to act as a thermal sink. Thermal source is what it would be, where they drop the propane canister into the thermal source of just water, and if the gas gets too cold, it will actually start freezing the water into ice, and that ice can be chipped away and replaced easily as you go, and the energy it takes to change water phases is a lot more than other types of materials, so it's actually a great sacrificial and easy way to get a lot out of a single bottle. But that's in extreme scenarios that almost certainly did not exist in this single person in a coffee shop. Let's continue again.
Whoa!
In January 2016, a young woman suffered severe burns and subsequently died from her injuries in a coffee stand explosion in Everett, Washington. The explosion was caused by a refilled propane DOT-39 cylinder that was stored inside the stand. Investigators in Washington.
There's the first claim. It was a refilled canister that caused the explosion. But if you keep listening and you listen a little bit further, you'll see them contradict themselves.
Washington concluded that propane gas leaking from a 20-pound barbecue-style cylinder.
The next sentence. Propane gas leaking from a 20-pound barbecue-style cylinder. The 1 pound was at fault, but the leak came from the 20-pound cylinder. Those two concepts are self-contradictory. Either the leak came from the 20-pound cylinder, or the cause was a 1 pound cylinder that was refilled. It cannot be both at the same time. There's always a root cause. Those are two separate, fundamentally separate root causes. Either one is wrong or they misspoke, and what they meant was the leak actually came from the refilled cylinder as it was being refilled. The problem with that is, well, you never refill canisters of any type indoors. This person should have put their 20-pound cylinder with their refill adapter just outside the door, attached their 1 pound bottle, opened the valve, and closed the door. Them doing it inside, which is completely advised against by every single quality, well-informed refill instruction, says to never do. Never inside. Always outside. And, I mean, it's propane. The person was using a space heater indoors. That's obvious. Sure. You've got a space heater indoors, you've got a source of ignition. Okay. So you do not want any sort of leaks. So this person carelessly took a tank inside where they were frequently changing valves, frequently changing threaded connections, and may not have tightened their connections very well. So this person made a mistake by trying to refill indoors. That means the cause, the root cause, was not following instructions properly. If we actually want to blame an object or thing, well, you could blame the person because they didn't follow instructions and tried to refill indoors. Or you could blame the 20-pound canister for leaking, the refill valve for not making a very positive seal. A lot of cheap eBay things are slightly out of tolerance and may not actually work because they can't be certified because you're not actually supposed to have them. But I'll get to why having them doesn't actually mean a bad thing after we talk about why they say you can't refill those canisters.
Was ignited by the open flame of a propane space heater's pilot light, which was used to heat the stand.
Open flame of a space heater that runs on propane. Okay, so the leakage absolutely, definitely happened indoors. And if you look at that valve, this one picture, this one slide, there's no canister attached at all. So there's two possibilities. The person left the main valve fully open and trusted this to prevent the up to I think it's like 170 psi at like 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're probably heating the space to about 70, so it's probably more like 150 psi. I forget the exact table, but the pressure varies between 100 and about 200 psi depending on the outdoor temperature, and they never really measure below about 100 in standard scenarios, except for like literal winter weather outside, which most people wouldn't be using one of these tiny canisters on a grill or camper at those extreme temperatures. Well, they might use it on a camper, but you're still going to get well above 50 psi, which is already downregulated for your appliances in your camper. So no bottle attached. So the leakage could either have been an aging canister, which I do see what looks like a potential patina of rust on the side. So this canister may have already been past its expiration due to poor handling, because it's got what looks like surface damage that could be akin to rust. I mean, it's hard to tell because fire. Or it could have been the fact that this refill valve is not actually designed to block pressure. It's designed to adapt one thread type to another. This could be, I think this is actually the POL type connection, which is pretty common with these refill adapters. There's also QCC1, which is the more common one used directly on a grill. I think they both go over top. The one goes over top of it and has the POL bit inside of it. But either way, this is not designed to stop pressure. There was no bottle here, so this thing was being trusted to prevent leakage, and it didn't. Pretty obvious. You should have turned off the main valve, which it looks like either the main valve was made of a metal that is softer or has a lower melting point and the fire destroyed it, or it was removed, which is odd. If you're using it indoors to refill tiny bottles, you'd think you'd leave the valve on and not trust this dinky little thing that, I mean, the pressure is supposed to be on this side of this little connector, so that disposable 1 pound throwaway canister valve is not designed to prevent pressure from leaking into the can. It's designed to prevent pressure from leaking out of the can. So obviously we're trusting this to do a job it was never designed to do. Let's continue. Hold on, let me, oh, the mouse is on the other screen. Whoops.
She had been using the 20-pound cylinder with a coupler to transfer propane to refill it.
Coupler. Just to reiterate, a coupler is not a thing that's designed to stop pressure. The proper term for a coupler is actually something that just adapts or connects two different connections together. So it's a coupler. It was never designed to hold pressure, so it will leak. So you should not have it inside and have the gas flow turned on.
A DOT-39 1-pound cylinder. While you may think you are saving yourself some money and can find instructional videos online on how to refill your DOT-39 1-pound cylinders from larger propane cylinders, stop. DOT-39.
Those instructions almost always involve passive fill rates. This means the canister being refilled and the source canister are at the same pressure and roughly the same temperature. Now, you do slightly, in order to actually get liquid to condense in the target canister, you will need to chill it or ever so slightly, or heat the main canister ever so slightly. This is problematic, to say the least, because most of those larger 20-pound canisters are of a lighter color they are also thicker material. So they will tend to be at a lower temperature over time compared to a dark green colored camp gas cylinder, or blue, or whatever color other countries use. White will simply absorb less heat energy overall than the colored canisters. So you will have to either stick the smaller canister into a bath of, say, ice water, real simple, real cheap way to move things around, or stick the larger canister inside of a hot water bath, or say a slight warming blanket, which really necessarily only gets up to about 50 Celsius, which, while pushing the canisters to their limits, would not quite cause a grill canister to explode if left on extremely low. I don't know if I'd use a heating blanket in that case. I'd probably just use I'd probably put the smaller canister in a bath of cold water. And no, inverting the 20-pound canister to get liquid to directly gravitationally drain into the smaller canister is not ideal, because the liquid in the connections, upon disconnecting the cylinder, could cause severe cryogenic burns as it suddenly boils off. And the extreme pressure could literally sandblast your frozen skin off of your hands. You don't want to be messing with extremely high pressure liquids that boil at extremely low temperatures. It just isn't cool. So I would not be using one of those tiny adapters. I would be using a short hose, about 1 foot long, about 0.5 meter maybe, to go from the main canister's top valve, and to put the smaller canister with an adapter at that point on the ground in a bucket of ice water. That way the top of the canister is pointing upwards, so the only point that liquid's going to condense is wherever there's cold. So once you start getting into the hose, it won't tend to condense as much, because you'll start to have thermal resistance at that point. It's still not the safest, so I would probably use a shutoff valve at that point. Effectively, what I do is I put the shutoff valve directly onto this thing that I found on Amazon, which is a 1 pound throwaway to NPT 1/4, and I would of course use plenty of thread tape to seal it up so it did not leak, and I would put the shutoff valve directly above that. The purpose of that being that I could very easily control the gas flow very locally to the canister being refilled, and so any liquid that condenses will only be less than an alcohol shot worth of liquid, which, while not the best, would still be better than anything else. In which case, I would also I would probably use something akin to large leather work gloves, or gardening type gloves, which are designed to have a more solid, non-absorbent surface, and also be very thick in order to provide the insulation to my hands to prevent issues. And I would never, ever attempt to refill canisters indoors, which this person was clearly refilling canisters indoors, clearly either had a bad valve on their main canister, or they left the valve open and trusted a coupler not meant to prevent leakage, both of which were no-nos, in which case it was probably not the canister's fault at all for refill issues. Oh, you could also use a rag, just a damp rag, laying on top the larger canister. That damp rag would provide evaporative cooling, which would change the temperature only a fraction of a degree, but a fraction of a degree would still provide filling because the gas always wants to condense where it's colder. It just would. Because the pressure would be ever so slightly lower, because it'd be condensing slightly more, it would always flow towards whatever canister is colder. Let's stop ranting there because I'm adding way too much time to this 4-minute 20-second video. I'm going to literally pass half an hour before I finish.
39 cylinders are not designed to ever be refilled. Let me emphasize, DOT-39 cylinders of any size, including the 1-pound cylinders, are not meant or designed to be refilled.
Okay, so DOT-39 is a classification. I could literally design a clone of a DOT-39 cylinder that was designed to be refilled. And I guess then it would not be DOT-39 because it would actually be designed to be refilled, so it would no longer fall into the same classification. Which is really confusing. You should just say don't refill camp cylinders, which is the most common one to be refilled.
They are designed for one-time use and are to be recycled or disposed after use when empty. DOT
Recycled or disposed? No, just recycled. They are 99.9 whatever. They're entirely steel and other metals. There might be a tiny bit of rubber in there in the valve mechanism, but that tiny bit of rubber, I mean, that's the only thing that can't be recycled. The rest absolutely 100% should be recycled and not just thrown in the trash. I hate people who claim that it's disposable. I can just throw it in the trash. No. If it is 99% recyclable materials, you should always recycle it. If you can. In my case, I have issues with recyclable materials because in my area, recyclables are actually not a weekly pickup and they don't have a specialized bin. It's just you put it to the side right before the trash night, and if you're doing a lot of paper stuff like cardboard, it has to be kept dry. But what if it's raining on the day trash comes? It's not. It's stupid. In which case, I may bend the rules and actually put the recyclable materials in the trash because I cannot recycle. It's not economically viable for me. Though for people who it is, you absolutely should recycle. If you have a recycle bin, put this canister in your recycle bin. Do not put it in your trash can. It is recyclable, and honestly, if when it reaches the recycling plant, they'll be able to tell if there's anything in it, and they will actually just vent the excess if it has no liquid left in it. It's totally fine. Always recycle it. So let's continue. Mute the mic again.
DOT-39 cylinders are built with thin walls that are weakened by the stresses of refilling.
Okay, so if I designed it with thicker walls, it would not be DOT-39. So apparently DOT-39 is a legal class or a certification class that is not necessarily the style, it is the wall thickness and valve reliability. Nothing else.
Further, the coupling of a larger DOT propane cylinder to a DOT-39 cylinder can cause leakage that may...
Yes, it can cause leakage because a lot of these things are designed absolutely terribly. You need good threaded connections in order to make sure that your connections are good. You need threaded connections, and in anything but the the quick connect design threads, like the bottle thread and the direct thread off of the larger canister, both those threads are actually designed to self-seal without any packer, such as Teflon tape. But any intermediary connections absolutely have to be properly sealed. And you always absolutely have to tighten your connections down as hard as it says in the specs, which often most people don't do. So the leakage is caused by not tightening your stuff down or using a valve that doesn't actually fit the specification because it's forbidden by the specification, even though there's nothing stopping you from designing a cylinder that is small, such as a camp fuel cylinder, that is actually refillable. I'm surprised someone has not actually designed that yet because of regulations. There's nothing stopping you from taking that same throwaway, in quote marks, throwaway thread and putting it onto a more robust bottle capable of proper refilling. And of course putting in a check valve that is much more robust to multiple cycles. There's nothing stopping that from existing except regulations that say you can only sell one-shot bottles, which to me is entirely wasteful. It is so much more efficient. That's why these 20-pound bottles, you see, these 20-pound bottles, they're almost always refilled for up to 10 years based on discretion of the condition, like how rusty it is. My dad actually had 2 bottles that had no labels left, and the only thing that was left is the date marker stamped in that top piece of rounded sheet metal that protects the valve. That was the only markings left on it, and it was peppered with a little bit of rust, but the kind of rust that is clearly only a surface layer and is not actually compromising the structure very badly. But as it was stamped that it was manufactured over 10 years ago, he finally had to just buy new ones because there is actually an age to which they are no longer trusted to be refilled. So if these can be refilled and they're designed robustly and have a safety margin that it effectively becomes invalid after a while, or a certain amount of rust, then why can't we design a smaller cylinder? Yeah. Tell me why we can't have refillable small cylinders other than they're not designed for it. Well, why can't we just design them for it?
May not easily be detected, which can contribute to fire.
Leaks that may not easily be detected. Sure. Attempting to refill things that aren't designed to be refilled could cause a scenario where a bottle's valve leaks ever so slightly. Now, there is a way to actually test for this. Upon refilling your bottle, after you finish filling it up, place a balloon over the end of it. Completely emptied balloon. If the balloon inflates any noticeable degree, which it shouldn't inflate at all, but if it inflates, then your canister is not holding pressure, it is leaking, and therefore the refill attempt failed. In which case, you then reverse the refilling by connecting it back to your big canister, and instead of the whole cooling the small one and heating the big one, you put the big one in a bucket of ice water, and all the gas comes out of the small one. And then you throw it away once it's no longer got liquid in it, which can take several hours if done slowly, the only way that is safe for these small canisters. I'll explain that once they bring that up.
Fire or explosion, as was the case.
Explosions are caused by leakage that builds up to a critical point where the oxygen-fuel ratio reaches the optimal level. Now, for highly flammable gases, for highly flammable fuels, this ratio, it starts with just extremely flammable, and it only becomes explosive when the amount of vaporized fuel, basically fuel in the gaseous phase. So this works for any type of fuel, from solid paraffin wax all the way to passing gasoline and going all the way to LPG variants like propane and butane. It can become explosive so long as the combustion becomes optimal. Once there is nothing restricting the combustion, such as too much air to fuel ratio, or too much fuel to air ratio, once that optimal, I think it's stoichiometric ratio is reached, any fuel can become explosive. And propane and other LPG variants in particular, well, pretty much any hydrocarbon, but we tend to worry about gases in it because you can't see gases, at least not easily, because it is possible to see them in high concentration because there's like a slight refraction from the extremely dense gas and the air around it. But it's harder to see if it's super hot in the environment because you already got heat haze. Any gas can become explosive. All fuels will tend to pool at the lowest point, except of course hydrogen, but we're not talking about hydrogen because hydrogen is not that common yet. In the case of hydrogen, if you have any sort of high up vent in your home, even just a slight crack in the structure of the roof or the eaves or anything, the hydrogen will float to the highest point and will eventually leak its way out because it's such a tiny molecule. So, any gas is explosive. Any fuel is explosive if the ratios are met. All fuels are flammable. That's kind of what makes it a fuel, is that it combusts. So, yes. And in the case of propane / butane / methane, which is the primary component of your city natural gas, all of them, being that they are gases, are hard to detect other than chemically or using additives, odorants, which, I mean, it's pretty easy to smell the stinkiness of a fart. That's because it contains hydrogen sulfide. So you just put a little hydrogen sulfide into your natural gas stream, which is also flammable, and so long as it burns up, you won't get no smell. If it starts leaking, though, you get smell. I don't understand why they don't do that a lot more with propane and butane. Or at least propane. The butane for lighters is a little trickier. But like for the butane for camp stoves, why don't they just add odorants to camp stove fuels? Why don't they sell the odorant for adding to your own fuels if you need to? It's like the whole point of it is stupid. But yeah, let's continue now that we have said that, okay, the cause of the explosion was leakage being ignited by a pilot light, And you claim that leakage comes from the 20-pound cylinder, so why are we talking about 1-pound cylinders? Except for the fact that a lot of those adapters are poorly sized.
In the tragedy in Everett. Propane gas is extremely flammable, and any ignition sources, such as any open flames, must be kept away from cylinders containing propane. A release of propane gas could result in a flash fire or a rupture of a cylinder if it gets caught in the fire.
Okay. Yes. Propane is extremely flammable. Gasoline's extremely flammable too, but we're a lot more lenient because it's a liquid fuel, and finding out that there's a leak is pretty easy, because it's also fairly smelly because of additives that are very modern. So basically, yeah, a fuel is flammable. It can become explosive. So
Always follow the manufacturer's instructions for safe operation of equipment that uses propane.
for equipment that uses propane, okay, what about equipment that stores propane? These are funny language quirks that can actually be a loophole in law, depending on how the laws go. Yeah, okay. Federal law forbids transportation if refilled. Okay, sure. Well, what if you don't transport it? What if you are literally using a big 20-pound canister, or even bigger, and you only use one of these tiny canisters, say for your map gas torch, or propane torch. Say it's your machine shop, and you tend to use the flame to do some soldering of things you're building. Or say you use it to ignite your fireplace, which the YouTuber AVE tends to do a lot. He uses the propane torch with its simple piezo igniter as an easy way to ignite other things, because it's just more easy for him to do. What if you're not transporting it? And you shouldn't put it in luggage or anything. Like, it's a fuel. It's a canister of fucking pressurized fuel. Be careful with it. Do not get it super hot. So storing it directly in the sun or in a super hot shed that actually gets to the point where it could literally kill someone if they walk inside it without airing it out first. Don't put your propane in there, because the pressure goes up as the temperature goes up. Store it under and store it outside of structures in a well ventilated but shielded from the weather enclosure. The cages you see outside of stores that actually hold propane bottles are the absolute most ideal, underneath a small roof overhang in a metal cage that is completely open to fresh air. This allows the bottles to not be in a dank environment where they'll rust, and also protects them from direct rain or snow exposure, and also protects them from direct sunlight, and also internal heating from being inside a hot environment like a shed. That's why they store them outside of the store. Because one, they're gonna leak eventually, so especially used bottles where a person may not have tightened the valve down as tightly as they should, and so there's just a tiny bit of pressure slowly leaking out. And could be a problem if stored indoors. 2, keeping them in a cage that is completely open air and not solid sheet metal means they won't get heated too much, and they also won't be in a dank environment. 3, it's almost always under an overhang. The local grocery store near me has a cage which has the ice box and the propane box underneath the overhang that's like 12 feet off of the building onto pillars where they sometimes display merchandise. That's the perfect place because it keeps the propane cool and dry. Both are very ideal. It's like a potato. You keep it cool and dry. Unfortunately, you also keep it outside, but it's like a potato plus the outside part because leakage. So don't put your propane bottles inside. Don't attempt to refill propane bottles inside, which this person pretty obviously did. So it's not that they refilled a small bottle, it's that they refilled indoors with an active open flame space heater. I'm not saying that it was this person's fault. You gotta do what you gotta do. I mean, this person was operating a small shop probably by themselves and probably didn't have time to keep going in and out and in and out and in and out. They probably had to refill several bottles throughout the day to run their little cook stove to heat their coffee, heat the water for coffee, or run their little generator or something. So they didn't think about the dangers because they were already stressed by the need to make money, which that's a whole nother political can of worms. Why universal basic income is not a bad thing. Literally everybody needs a bare minimum to survive. Once you exceed that bare minimum is where it should actually come into question. Because being given basic food and food, shelter, and the basics to actually wear clothes outside, to go shopping for groceries like food, that's pretty important. But that's not part of this video. Let's continue.
Propane cylinders should be stored outdoors.
Like I just said, they should be stored and utilized in cases where you either directly monitor leakage, such as a space heater that has an actual rubber ring inside of it to try to mitigate any chance of leakage down loose threads. Like most appliances, that refill adapter probably was missing the O-ring because it can fall out, but you know, just always store and utilize your propane in the most well ventilated area you can get a hold of. It's better to use it completely outside, but if you have to use it indoors, be very, very, very careful for leaks.
So that if there is a leak, vapor will not accumulate.
Like it accumulated indoors because this person used a refill coupler and left the big tank valve completely open, which is actually fairly easy to open and close, so I don't know why they didn't just close it every time rather than trust it. I mean, it was probably a cheap off-brand thing that actually should be something that makes you a little wary in use. Why didn't they just put the canister right outside the door? The vapors accumulated to explosiveness not because they were refilling a cylinder, but because they used an improper coupler, which is fairly easy to get a hold of. Especially, my dad had a propane regulator on his grill that actually got physically damaged. It like popped apart loose and was leaking a ton of gas while he was cooking, but since he was outside at the time and he was in the middle of cooking when he finally noticed, he finished his cooking and then quickly realized he needed to get another regulator before using his grill again. Since he was outside and the flame was well above the source of gas in a completely exposed yard, the gas that leaked out was able to just float away, and it was fine. And come on. Oh, that's not a bug, that's the audio. I have these little two gnats that are driving me nuts right now. You can't always have a perfect life. Gonna be up to an hour before I'm done, but I have to address all of these points as they pop up.
This practice decreases the possibility of fire from an ignition source, as happened.
Decreases the possibility. Correct. There's never a 0% chance of fire or explosion when using a flammable gas inside of a structure. There's always an amount of risk. Most often, it is better to keep your canisters either small or completely outdoors, as the initial fireball of a small failed canister will be very small, and therefore it should be relatively easy to put out a fire that has consumed all of the existing fuel in the small canister, which is why non-refillable only as the options for small canisters is a bit of a stupid thing to have. There should be canisters that are refillable because, well, they're thicker, more reliable, and if there is a failure, it's better to have a small canister indoors than a large canister. And, well, there's never a 0% risk of death. There's always a risk. The risk is something we've just accepted that, okay, yeah, this percent chance is very small, but if I do things just right, which most people don't, if we do things just right, it should be statistically not a 0% chance. It'll probably be like 0.0000001 or some crazy small percentage like that, but you get the point. So small that it's meaningless.
And in the Everett incident. Always be aware of the rotten egg or skunk smell of the chemical added to.
Additives. Propane, when leaking, stinks. Don't ignore it. It's intentionally there that if you smell that smell, there is a leak. And you should shut off all of your valves and remove all of your canisters from any fittings, and then slowly trace which device was leaking by reattaching things and opening valves one at a time. Obviously, in this case, this person was probably super busy and ignored it for a moment. Never ignore gas leaks. Ever.
Propane. This smell indicates that there is a propane gas leak. Immediately do the following. Extinguish all flames. Do not operate light switches, appliances, or use phones, as sparks from
I think they're talking about landlines. They really should specify non-cell phones. All cell phones don't have actual sparks. And the flashlight of your phone can be critically useful when you have to not use light switches, which actually do create sparks. These instructions are incomplete, and appliances is a very vague term. And also, any appliances, all phones, all light switches, and also you shouldn't be doing things indoors in the first place if you can avoid it with propane, and even if you can't, you should be using something like an exhaust fan or something that is very close. I guess to a point these instructions make sense, but you're forgetting about cell phones and the fact that they do not create sparks. Cell phones do not create sparks at all. The minuscule little current, that the voltage change, the current going through the tiny micro switches on your phone, that's not going to create a spark with enough energy to ignite any propane. This is only for the case of landline driven phones that tend to have around 40 volts on the line, and when they connect the line, they can spark at their connection point because they're often very old fashioned and can even use a rotary disconnector to dial the number. So this, do not use any phones. No. Do not use any hardwired phones. Cell phones may be permissible as they do not create sparks. I don't know why they say phones at all, because these days, in the days of YouTube, the only people that have landlines, they wouldn't be picking up their phone in the middle of backtracing a gas leak. They may pick up a flashlight. They're not going to pick up their landline phone. So mentioning the phone just creates confusion against cell phones. But let's continue with so many errors so far that I'm already up to an hour.
These could ignite the leaking propane. Leave the building. You may need to warn others if you are not the only one in the building. Call 911. Do not return to the building until qualified personnel have determined that it is safe to do so.
How the fuck am I supposed to call 911 if you told me not to even use my cell phone? How the fuck does that work? And just leave the building? Not leave the building and leave any doors and windows that you can open on the lower floors in order to allow the gas to escape? Incomplete instructions and contradictory safety instructions are part of the issue why people don't follow the safety instructions. They must be concise and not tell you to do things or avoid things that are stupid. A cell phone is fine. That's how you call 911. You pick up your cell phone, you use the flashlight to get out the house, maybe notify the other people that I smell gas, let's get the hell out of here, don't use any light switches, walk out the door, then use your cell phone that you were already using the flashlight mode on to call 911 and say, hey, there's a gas leak in my home. I need a professional out here to make sure that it's not one of my main pipes, and I have to go in and find the shutoff valve in a gas-filled building that could kill me from asphyxiation. Yeah, gas leaks are dangerous, especially if the accumulation gets high enough without actually burning. But these instructions are dumb and self-contradictory in a lot of places.
DOT urges you to never refill any DOT-39 cylinders, as it is
any disposable cylinders, you shouldn't refill them unless in extremely specific cases where you are not using a direct pump to transfer the fuel, you're just using passive transfers. Those are actually fairly safe because the canisters are designed to reach the maximum pressure of the propane in normal use and storage, so up to 200 psi. I think that's like what is that, like 7 bar? 7 or 8 bar? In those crazy non-USA countries. Sorry, not actually crazy, but you get the point. So they're designed to handle the maximum pressure of propane at normal storage or operational temperatures. So passive transfer is totally fine. I'd actually argue that you can actually use a torque restricted active pump transfer, but nobody actually has a thing like that, so let's just say passive only. Yeah, don't refill things unless you have a very specific use case and you know that refilled canisters are less trustworthy than brand new ones for leakage, obviously.
Is illegal. Contact a qualified refiller if you cannot determine if a cylinder is authorized to be refilled.
Okay, sure. Contact one of your local refillers. Those actually are fairly common around the USA because propane is also a fairly common portable fuel. I actually think that that's actually a good point. Go to your local refiller, take your can with you, say, "Hey, can this be refilled?" And if so, can you do it? If not, well, is there a way to get a cheap one that's full rather than actually outright buying a brand new one? Can I like exchange it for a slight discount because you get the recycled cost of the canister? Yeah.
For more information about propane cylinders, hazard communication, or the hazardous materials regulations, contact PHMSA's Hazmat Info Center at 1-800-467-4922 or email the Info Center at infocntr@dot.gov. If you want to know more, check.
Okay. So, what have we learned? Safety regulations can often be self-contradictory, can often include ancient technologies as forbidden, but not take into account that the modern terminology for modern technology is the same as those ancient technologies. And so when an ancient technology becomes completely phased out, you should update your regulations to specify that the ancient technology is the one you should not use. Also, the leave the home completely doesn't specify the fact that you should probably turn off all of your gas flows with your cell phone light on the way out. Because, yeah, you don't want to breathe in propane, but the short amount of turning off all your valves on the way out when you start smelling it isn't going to kill you. It's prolonged exposure to high concentrations that's going to kill you. So if your breathing is not already labored, if your breathing's not starting to feel a little funny, then you're probably fine to turn off the valves, which could actually be the source of the leak. So you make it a little bit safer that you just walk out after turning off the valves of whatever's nearby you, rather than letting them continue to leak. As you go outside, not using your cell phone, even though the cell phone doesn't cause any sparks, and then somehow call the authorities without your cell phone. And that the government agencies regulating this crap tried to use a completely unrelated failure to advocate against refilling something. Sounds to me like they specifically made this just for propaganda. So I absolutely had to address it. Yes, You can refill these bottles so long as you accept that they are no longer transportation worthy and that the chance of leakage is much higher, so they should absolutely not be stored indoors, let alone the fact that you should never store propane indoors to begin with, which a lot of people do with these camp cylinders. So just, follow the actual basic safety instructions. Keep it outside, in the shade. Keep it from getting too much weather damage. And if you absolutely have a specific case scenario where you have to use 1 pound bottles, but you don't actually want to use 1 pound bottles, you can sort of refill them and use them as is, especially since they're pretty safe. Or, as I'd recommend a lot more, actually get one of those large 20-pound tank 2 throwaway cylinder adapters and adapt your little camp stove to use the big cylinder. Just saying, there's always a better solution than just outright saying, this bad, it bad because this thing happened that didn't happen because this bad thing. Yeah. I'm sorry, what were you called again? Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. I have to address the fact that you have a lot of information here that is misinformation. The failure was leakage caused by a valve being left open and relying on a coupler to prevent reverse flow. Well, actually, it's not even designed to prevent reverse flow. It's designed to flow straight in that direction when a cylinder is attached. So, the problem was the person was refilling cylinders inside and probably left their main cylinder valve not completely closed and were using a space heater inside. And so it was a disaster of multiple factors combined that caused this person to lose their life. The failure was almost certainly not directly related to 1 pound cylinders. It was related to any gas leakage in a confined space reaching an ignition source. And had this person actually done the basics of safety, keeping all non-in-use cylinders outside, and also, since they were using a space heater, possibly the most ideal scenario would have been to periodically open the door, just a crack to the outside, in order to prevent propane from pooling. And if it was absolutely too cold outside to do that, to place the ignition source well above any propane pileup, so that the time it would take to reach a critical mass would have been much larger, and by that point they would have smelled the gas prior to the explosion and would have absolutely known, open the damn door and turn off the heater. But it was the 1 pound cylinder's fault, even though it absolutely was not the 1 pound cylinder's fault. Sorry I had to actually say this, but yeah, guys, you fucked up. Your information and your storytelling is wrong. Now, yes, you still should not refill 1 pound propane bottles unless you have a very, very specific scenario where it makes more sense to refill a bottle while in use and then to absolutely not trust it for long-term storage. Absolutely makes sense. But yeah, your video was based on an example of something else failing, as advocation, as an example to support your claim, and it absolutely did not. And I hate when people do that. You must have direct evidence, not indirect evidence, not even disconnected evidence. It must be direct. So I got to address you guys. You fucked up. This video, I disliked it because it is wrong. I will also be sending an email to them to tell them that I know their video has important information in it, but they should not be pushing the irrelevant information, such as this explosion, which clearly was not caused by the 1 pound propane bottles, as support for the law. The law is the law. That's the reason why you should not refill propane bottles, not because some totally unrelated propane explosion just happened to include refilling bottles. In fact, they should have specifically said that refill adapters, as they are not actually regulated, may be out of tolerance and will cause more significant leaks, as they are not actually supposed to ever have been made. So that's that. An hour and 11 minutes to say something about a video that basically ends at 4 minutes, that has far too many errors and claims that don't make any sense. Hopefully they'll actually change this shit after I message them. And if they don't, well, I posted on Facebook as, well, while this is tragic, their entire point over why you shouldn't is fallacious, because it doesn't actually apply to the actual reason why the explosion occurred. Yes, one bottle did actually explode, most certainly, based on that fireball, but the bottle didn't explode because it was refilled. It exploded because of a leak causing a fire, causing an explosion. The leak was the problem, not the refilled bottle. And they even say it was the 20-pound cylinder that was leaking. It probably was, because they probably left that valve wide open. I don't know all the facts, but I do know that based on what they claimed, including that in the video, is emotional manipulation rather than actual